The senator from Kentucky is recognized.
We are rapidly approaching a milestone in our country, and it's not a good one. We're rapidly approaching $30 trillion in debt. We're accumulating debt like we never have at any time in our history. We're actually accumulating debt at the rate of over $2 million per minute. Now, some say deficits don't matter. Some on the left say they have this new monetary theory. We can just print it all up. You can all have free stuff. There'll be manna from heaven, and nothing could go wrong. We're just going to give you money. If not $1,400 checks a month or a year, why don't we give you monthly checks? And that's part of the new plans. The new plans of the $3.5 trillion that we're facing down at this point, that'll all be borrowed, is to give people free money, to give people free this, free that. But I think people are smarter than that. I think people know that ultimately you don't get anything in life without hard work. You don't get anything in life really for free. Isn't there some kind of ramification to so much borrowed money? When someone comes to you and says, or they call you on the phone and they say, here's $1,000, all you got to do is sign up for this. Most people immediately recoil and they say, well, that might be a scam. Somebody's going to be ripping me off to say that. Well, it's sort of the bait and switch of the politics we face now. People are saying, we're going to give you free college, free cars, free cell phones, free this, free that. Everything in life will be free. You won't have to work anymore. The problem is there are ramifications. Money doesn't grow on trees. The money's got to come from somewhere. So either we borrow it, we become more indebted to foreign countries, we tax people for it, or ultimately the way we fix a lot of our deficit problems is we simply print the money. And so when the Federal Reserve prints the money, as we increase the money supply, the money that we have becomes worth less and less. It loses its purchasing power. This is the insidious tax of inflation. And the interesting thing about it is inflation is a regressive tax. It doesn't affect everyone the same. In fact, the tax of inflation actually affects the working class, the people of lower incomes, and those on fixed incomes and pension, retirees. It affects them much worse because they don't have the ability for their income to go up. So right now we're facing 5% inflation because of the massive borrowing that really both parties instituted in the last year. They decided that the result to the pandemic would be to close everything down, destroy the economy, and then give everyone free money. And to a large extent, both parties actually did this last year. Now this year, the decision has been made by Republicans to say, whew, this is so much, we got to stop. We got to get people back to work and let the economy recover. So it's primarily been Democrats this year. But both parties have a certain responsibility to this, at least some members of both parties. But as the inflation occurs, and this effect is being transmitted to the economy, you find that those who suffer are those who cannot raise their income, those who have fixed income or low income. One of the things you see here is that if we have 5% inflation, what does that mean? You say, well, I don't know, that means I lose my purchasing power by 5% next year. But what if it happens year in, year out for a decade, and you've lost 50% of your purchasing power? It means to make up for that you really have to have a 50% increase in your wages. So will wages keep up with inflation? The dirty little secret is that in some ways wages will rise, but maybe they rise an equivalent amount or a little bit less, and you say a decade later, I'm not any better off. And there become people mired and more dependent on government as government gets larger and larger, and they think they're getting free stuff, but it's not really free. The allure of something for nothing. This is the allure of socialism. This is a false allure. It's something that you're going to be able to get something and you're not going to have to pay for it. So we've accumulated $30 trillion in debt. Interest payments have been fairly low over the past decade or so. Interest payments are about, 1, 2, 2.5%. But now interest rates are rising. Even at the low interest rates, our interest rate that we pay each year has grown to about $300 billion a year. So $300 billion a year, and people say, well, there's a debt ceiling. If the debt ceiling doesn't come up, we'll default, and Wall Street will become hysterical, and there'll be a collapse of the stock market. Well, there doesn't need to be. Nobody really is for spreading discalm or spreading, chaos among the marketplace. We all want the marketplace to be calm. How could we calm the marketplace? What we would say to the marketplace is, we'll pay our bills. We're not going to default on our currency. And the way you can pay for your bills is pay for it with income. We bring in $3.8 trillion a year in tax revenue. The interest payment is $300 billion. It's less than we bring in 1 month. So the annual payment on interest is less than what we bring in tax revenue in 1 month. Why can't we pay the interest? Why would we ever not pay the interest on our debt? Why? Because we're overdrawn and because all the rest of the spending is crowded out by the interest. We've got plenty of money to pay for the interest. We just don't have enough left to pay for the cocaine studies with Japanese quail. That's about $1 million. You say, it's only $1 million. Well, they studied Japanese quail to see whether or not Japanese quail on cocaine, to see if they're more sexually promiscuous. How did we get to a $30 trillion debt? Because there's studies like that littered throughout the budget. In fact, the group that does these studies, the National Science Foundation, we just increased their budget by 2/3. Mostly Democrats, but once again, many of the big government Republicans voted for this too. So we've exploded the National Science Foundation. Now, was there any warning that the National Science Foundation was one of the most wasteful parts of our government? Well, yeah, since 1972, there was a senator at the time named William Proxmire. He was a conservative or maverick Democrat from the Midwest, and he started an award. He called it the Golden Fleece Award. And the first award he gave was for a study from the National Science Foundation. It was over a study that was $50,000. That was when $50,000 was a lot of money. And the study was to see what makes people happy. Really? And people were aghast that we were spending $50,000 on it. And he complained. He gave him a booby prize, an award, the Golden Fleece Award. And lo and behold, we're still doing it. This same organization last year did a $1.5 million study that if you take a selfie of yourself while smiling and then look at the selfie later on, does it make you happy? That cost $1.5 million. Why do people like each other? Why do people fall in love? These aren't studies for taxpayer dollars, but these are small ticket items. They say, oh, you can never balance the budget on that. Well, what about $70 million spent on a hotel in Kabul that the contractor ran off with the money and it was never built? What about a $48 million gas station, no, strike that, natural gas station in a remote area of Afghanistan? Well, very few, if anybody in the United States has a car that runs on natural gas. Why was the U.S. government building a natural gas station in Afghanistan? Because we've gone woke on the green climate. We are for the green climate. We got to combat climate change and reduce the carbon footprint of Afghanistan. Really? I thought the military was supposed to kill the enemies, defend the country. But we're reducing the carbon footprint in Afghanistan. Somebody put up, I think it was Rod Dreyer put up this the other day. It was a little video clip, and it was tragic, but somewhat hilarious in its tragicness. He said, this is when we lost the Afghan war. And it had a picture of a urinal. I think it was Marcel Duchamp was some Dadaist artist back in like 1917, and I guess he thought it would be really hilarious to put a male urinal in a museum and call it art. And I don't know if it was really art or if it was a joke, but the thing is we're having these Afghan men and women in robes and veils and everything studying Dadaist art, a male urinal, and asking them what they thought of this. And you could see a couple of the women just going and just sort of shaking their head with utter incomprehension. But when we're spending money sending PhDs over to Afghanistan to teach Dadaist art about that a male urinal is somehow art, I think that's why some of them think that we're actually the culture that's in decay, not them. But the thing is we are spending money right and left. The right spends it on military adventure, the left spends it on welfare, and the compromise that always happens around here is right comes together with left, and they all agree to, well, we might as well just spend it on both. So everything goes up. The military budget went up. We already spend more than all of the countries, more than 10 countries combined is our military budget. $750 some odd billion. Republicans and Democrats just raised it $25 billion more. In the midst of ending a war, where's the peace dividend? What happened? We ended a war. I thought we'd have a little more money left over. So today I tried to take $6 billion that that's supposed to go to the Afghan Reconstruction Fund, to the old Afghan government. There is no Afghan government. They've been overrun by the Taliban. I want to have, and I would love for Americans that are watching this, call me today at my office and tell me why the Taliban should get money. But I ask that we take that money away, put it back in the Treasury, spend some of it on the Iron Dome for Israel, and it was objected to by the Democrats because, by golly, they'll spend money, but they don't want to offset it with any spending cuts. Well, really? We should have $0 being sent to any government in Afghanistan. I asked Secretary Blinken about this, and his response was, well, I can't guarantee it, and if they are meeting expectations and they're acting and behaving properly, they might get this money. Really, I don't see a scenario or a world under which U.S. taxpayer dollars would be going to the Taliban. It makes utterly no sense at all. But we have spending that is literally out of control. The only time I've ever heard a Democrat, most of the time they're honest, they don't care about the debt, but the only time I've ever heard them say anything about the debt is, well, it happens because you cut taxes. Well, it's verifiably false. You can go back to the Reagan tax cuts when the rates went from 70 to 50 and then from 50 to 28. You know what happened? The government got more revenue. Because when you tax people less, when you let them keep more of their own money, guess what? Their incentives to produce go up, and the economy grows by leaps and bounds. So when Reagan cut taxes dramatically, the economy responded and grew tremendously. When we cut taxes in 2017, same thing. Revenue didn't go down, revenue went up. So how did the deficit get worse? Why did the deficit get worse? Was it because we cut taxes in 2017? No, it was because we piled on the money. We just are spending money like there's no tomorrow. So before we get to the extraordinary times we live in now, where everything's about COVID and we're just going to spend money like there is no tomorrow, before we got to that, we were borrowing $1 trillion a year. So the main segments of government, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, other welfare, and military. That probably comprises 3/4 or more of government. If you look at that on an annual basis, before you get to the extraordinary binge of the last 2 years, we were already $1 trillion short every year, $1 trillion short. So last year we added a couple trillion more, and our deficit for the year, for 1 year, was $3 trillion. We've never, ever borrowed that much. There are going to be ramifications. You're already seeing some of the ramifications. You're seeing the prices in the grocery store go up. You're seeing the prices in the pump go up. You're seeing sometimes wages go up, but you're also seeing prices rising faster than wages, which often happens in an inflationary cycle. Some people have trouble comprehending how these numbers, what's a billion, what's a trillion. Reagan had an analogy he did, and he said that if you want to know how big a billion is, take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand. When you have them about 4 inches high, you've got $1 million. But if you want to know how much or how tall a stack of $1,000 would be if you had $1 trillion, it'd be 60 miles high, over 60 miles high. That's what kind of money we're talking about. That was to get to $1 trillion. So we have $1 trillion institutional debt that's added every year. But now we're talking about a time where they're talking about adding in one bill $3.5 trillion. The bill that they have before us has $1 billion in spending for every page. Every page of the bill has an extra $1 billion in spending. It's extraordinary. We've never ever seen anything like this. What happens when a country destroys its currency? We have examples in history. In Germany in 1923, the money was starting to lose its value in about September, and a loaf of bread might have cost 100 marks, where before it cost 1 mark. 2 weeks later, it was 1,000 marks, but then 2 weeks later, it was 10,000 marks, and then it was 1 million, and then it was several million. This happened in a 2-month period of time. People say, oh, when it comes, when the currency unravels, it'll be gradual. In Germany, it happened in a 2-month period. In Venezuela, the currency is completely worthless, same as Germany. It's almost better to burn your currency for fuel or warmth than it is to spend it. This is what happens when you have runaway spending and out-of-control deficits. Venezuela is one of the richest countries in South America. They have more oil underground than Saudi Arabia. But frankly, socialism doesn't work. Socialism is this borrow and spend. It is this alarming tendency to want to offer everybody everything and say it's going to be free. Many of these things backfire. For the last year, we've been saying, well, oh gosh, we feel sorry for workers, so we're going to pay them while they're unemployed. But guess what? If you pay them more than the market wage, more of them will choose unemployment, and more of them will choose unemployment, and more of them will stay unemployed for a longer period of time. We found this out in the 2008 recession. During the 2008 recession, we extended unemployment. It's normally 26 weeks, it's paid for by a tax, and it largely works within the confines of a state-run program. We extended it to 99 weeks, almost 2 years. But you know what the studies found? And this is part of the syndrome we have around here. It's sort of the big heart, small brain syndrome. I think many of these people want to help people. They just don't understand, but what they're doing is actually hurting the same people they're trying to help. So if you extend unemployment to 99 weeks, and then all of a sudden the guy at 99 weeks or a woman says, I need to get a job, and they go to the employer and they say, I've been out of work for 99 weeks, I've been on unemployment. And the other person applying for the job says, well, I've been out of work 10 weeks, and I'm looking for a job. Who do you think the employer hires? Every time. It's a person out of work 10 weeks. The person out of 99 weeks, they're like, there might be something wrong here. We might have gotten to the point where we've lost work ethic. So what have you done to that person that you tried to help? You've actually kept them out of the workplace so long that they become unemployable. After they become unemployable, what do they become? The permanently unemployable, the non-working part. You wonder who this is? 62% of the country is in the working force, 38% is not. These are people permanently out of the workforce. These aren't people who can't work. These are just people for one reason or another are no longer in the workforce. Now, some of them can be people who can't work, and we have sympathy for that. But many of them are people who just stayed out of work too long or took the wrong incentives or became addicted to drugs or alcohol because they weren't working. So there are things we can do in our country, but if we're not careful, it's going to slip away from us. I don't want our country to be Venezuela. I don't want our country to destroy its currency. But what we're offering is a more difficult sell because the other side is going to give you free college and free daycare and free cars and free cell phones. What we are offering is opportunity. What we're offering is the freedom to try to strive. We're offering equality before the law, not equality of outcome after you've done your work, after you've tried to participate. Equality before the law. And one of the interesting things that I think isn't often grasped by people is that if you want equal outcomes, if you want everybody to be the same and you want to equalize everybody, you actually have to treat them unequally. And in our country, it took a while, but we've gotten to the point where people truly believe in the concept of equality before the law. But if you also want to believe in equal outcomes at the end, realize you can't believe in both. They're mutually exclusive. You cannot believe in equality before the law if you want equal outcomes. If you want this so-called equity at the end, you want everybody to be equal at the end, you've got to treat them unequally. Because some people are either born with more talent, born with more money, born with more sense, luckier, work harder. There's a lot of reasons. If you put 100 people in a room and you give them all $5, within an hour, somebody's gotten more. Somebody had some cigarettes, somebody really wanted to smoke, and they've got another $1. The money spreads around the room. They've done these experiments. Money doesn't stay in one place. But it's by and large in a free society based on work. But once the government becomes in charge of things, it becomes less of a meritocracy and becomes more of a society based on who you know. So there are rich people. Don't get me wrong. And when you look at socialism, there are rich people. Maduro, Chavez, Castro, incredibly rich people. They own their own islands, they have billions of dollars. Their relatives are all rich. So instead of a society mostly based on merit, we talk about the greatness of America. One of the most important things about capitalism and freedom and what happened in America is for the first time, it wasn't based on who you were. It wasn't based on royal lineage. For the most part, Europe was, long-time landowners and royalty. And a very small percentage of the public did very well. In fact, before 1820, before the Industrial Revolution, virtually everybody in the world, 98% of the world lived in extreme poverty, a bare subsistence level, barely enough to eat. There was no obesity because there was barely enough food. You just scraped by. That was 98% of the world. Fast forward to today, after we've adopted what Adam Smith talked about as far as trade, division of labor, and capitalism, You know what we have now? When you look at poverty, less than $2 a day in the world, it's less than 10% of the world. You won't find this on television. There's not going to be any good news on television or in the newspaper. The poorest people in our country actually are equivalent to the middle class in most countries. We are a huge success, but we're a country misguided and led astray by media that aren't honest. So for example, if you watched CNN, you would think that nobody's getting vaccinated and it's a complete disaster and whoa, we're stuck in this rut because no one's vaccinated. It's completely untrue. Over 90% of people over 65 who are the most vulnerable are vaccinated. Now, sure, there are a lot of younger people who aren't vaccinated. There's some older people, but 90% is a pretty good success. Over age 50, it's like 75, 80% of people. People are informed. They know this is a disease that can affect any age, but affects primarily the older ages. For example, the one truth you won't be told is an 85-year-old has a 10,000 times greater chance of dying than the 10-year-old. Now, you think we should treat them the same? If you were their doctor, do you think a 10-year-old should get the same health care and the same prescriptions for what they need to do as an 85-year-old? It makes no sense at all. I see 10-year-olds and I see 5-year-olds out on the mall. My wife and I are walking down to the Lincoln Memorial the other day, and I see 5-year-olds in groups led by teachers wearing masks outside. There is no science to that. We got Dr. Fauci spreading mistruths across the country, saying we've got to forcibly vaccinate the kids. There's no science behind any of that. In fact, England is rejecting what we're doing. In England, because of the age skew, because of what they're seeing, that the people most at risk are of an older age, they're actually saying instead of forcibly vaccinating children, why don't we try to make the vaccine doses available for the elderly? Why don't we target our care to those who are at highest risk? We have a problem in our country. We have people who have so politicized science that there are people struggling and dying every day because they've never heard about monoclonal antibodies. We have people dying every day because the government, at the behest of Dr. Fauci and a few other people, have said you can't get monoclonal antibodies if you're in the hospital. I talk to people every day who really have not yet heard of monoclonal antibodies, who get COVID again after being fully vaccinated or sometimes not being vaccinated and are not getting the treatment. Because Dr. Fauci says if you're in the hospital, you don't get it. And so we have medicine that is coming from on high, from a central authority like the Politburo, and doctors are afraid to prescribe. This has never happened in our country before. Doctors were able to make their own decisions based on their own experience, based on studies, based on real-life examples, but using their own discretion. Now doctors are afraid to prescribe monoclonal antibodies, and many of them are disallowed from prescribing it in the inpatient. Realize the ridiculous nature of that. You're in the emergency room, you're sick and you're coughing, you might be dying from COVID. You get to the emergency room, you don't know what to say, you can barely talk. Your spouse has to be able to tell the doctor, please stop in the emergency room. Give them the monoclonal antibodies before they're admitted, because once they're admitted, we won't treat them. It's the same way with symptoms. You have to have symptoms within the first 10 days. If you don't have symptoms, if you're on day 11, you won't get monoclonal antibodies. It's completely arbitrary, it's capricious, and it has to do with government-mandated guidelines. Let's take some of the other truths or mistruths that are out there. I've said over and over again cloth masks don't work, because they don't. Peer-reviewed studies have shown time and time again cloth masks don't work. But when Dr. Fauci tells you all masks work, when he comes in all draped with 3 masks on himself, with little insignias, clever insignias of different sports teams, he's actually spreading a mistruth that causes lives to be lost. Why? Let's say you have a 75-year-old woman and she gets COVID and her husband's taking care of her. Do you think the advice to go into the room to feed her, bathe her, help her get in and out of her clothes while she's sick, wearing a cloth mask is a good idea or a bad idea? It's malpractice. And yet, for some reason, the left-wing media has lauded this man as the second coming, and what he's telling you is absolutely verifiably dangerous to your health. The only mask that really works of any real value is the N95 mask. The surgical masks have some value, but not very much. Most of the air is going around the mask. They just aren't of value, but you have to submit. The man's telling you to do it. You got to do what you got to do. But the thing is when you tell people something's safe, they tend to react to that and have behavior, and in their behavior, they're in favor of something that may well actually be risky behavior for them. The vaccinations, because we ignore natural immunity, we directed the vaccine to the wrong people and still are. So for example, because of Dr. Fauci's lead, India is accepting his lead as well. In India, there's not enough vaccine. They have 1 billion people. They can't vaccinate enough people fast enough. So if you have 1 billion people and you have 200 million doses of vaccine, who do you think you should give it to? Should you give it to the 10-year-old the same as the 85-year-old? No, that's ridiculous. But what about 2 65-year-olds, and one of them's had COVID and one of them hasn't? The studies are plentiful. The studies are throughout that say that if you've already had it, you have natural immunity to COVID, as good or better than the vaccine. Do you think it makes good public health policy to say that everybody that's 65 should get it, instead of saying, have you had it? Why don't we check you for antibodies if you think you've had it? Maybe you should wait until we've vaccinated every 65-year-old that doesn't have immunity. These are real things. These are real discussions. But if you have these, unless it's on the Senate floor, actually that's not even true. You can say this on the Senate floor and YouTube will take it down. I've had it happen. I've given speeches on the floor that YouTube takes down. So this is a world in which people need to realize and get back to the ideas of classical liberalism were that we debated things. Classical liberalism was about skepticism. It was about you having your opinion and me having my opinion. But the difference between the elitist or the collectivist point of view and the individual rights point of view is, I believe you have every right to your opinion. But if you're a collectivist and you believe that from the very top down, all medical decisions come from Dr. Fauci, and if he doesn't want you to fly, you don't get to fly, see, it's different from individual liberty, because I think if you have a differing opinion, you're welcome to your opinion. And if an airline has a policy I don't like, maybe I'd choose not to fly. But the idea that we're going to restrict everyone's behavior based on what they decide to do, what's next? People eat too many cheeseburgers, we're not going to give them a heart stent because we think they haven't behaved and they haven't listened to the doctors on what they should be eating. There is no end to this. But in the end, if we're not careful, we are going to spend this country into oblivion. COVID's a big cause of the extra spending we have now, but I can tell you there are ramifications. They're coming quick. They're coming in the form of higher prices, but there is no reason in the world for us to default. We have plenty of money. We should simply pay for the interest based on what comes in every month. And with that, I'd like to reserve my time and turn it over.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Sure.
Senator Paul, when you and I were both elected to the Senate back in 2010, I remember the national debt was an issue then. It was becoming large enough that people were concerned about it. And as it mounted, sometimes we had conversations about how long it might continue, how long it might continue to spiral upward. You surprised to see that here we are 11 years later, 11 years after you and I arrived here, and where it's gone since then?
I guess surprise is not the word I would choose. I would say disappointed. You know, the Tea Party movement, we had 100,000 people on the mall out there. People were concerned about the debt. They were concerned about constitutional government. I remember you and I meeting for the first time and talking about how we needed to reverse some of these terrible precedents that had allowed government to grow large, and that the courts need to reform government as well as government be reformed from its elected officials. But yeah, we had a great debate that summer. In the summer of 2011, we said we wouldn't raise the debt ceiling without reform.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us here at Golden State Times. If you're new to the channel, we encourage you to subscribe by clicking that middle button. Also, check out our previous video by clicking the video on the right, or a video you might enjoy by clicking the video on the left. Also, don't forget to click the thumbs up button and share this video on social media. Peace.